I could see her in my dream again, holding something small, stained with something that looked like a thick red pigment in her hands, laughing. When I woke up, the red pigment turned out to be blood. The blood was real, and it was mine. I had these nightmares twice every month for 5 years, not knowing that they were demonic manipulations orchestrated by someone close to me to make me childless. The dream, the nightmare, was still vivid in my mind. I had been walking through a thick forest, the kind that feels alive, where every shadow seems to reach for you, where the trees whisper your name. I was lost, but I wasn't alone. There were voices, loud and angry, coming from all directions, accusing me of things I didn't understand. And then I saw it, a pool of blood. It wasn't just blood on the ground, it was coming from me. My clothes were soaked, my hands dripping red. I felt a deep emptiness in my belly, a hollow space where something vital had once been. Anytime I had this nightmares, I always feel something has been forcefully carved out of my belly. It was a terrible feeling of emptiness that I could not explain. And there in my dream, in the distance, I saw her, an old woman, her eyes glowing like embers in the dark, staring at me with a smile that sent chills down my spine. I jolted awake with a start, clutching my stomach, half expecting to feel something there, but there was nothing. Just the cold sweat and the hollow ache that had been haunting me for years. I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break through my chest. 5 years. 5 long years of waiting, hoping, praying for a child that never came. Obinna was fast asleep beside me, oblivious to my turmoil. I glanced at him in the dim light, wondering if he had dreams like mine. He never said much about the childlessness, but I knew it weighed on him just as heavily as it did on me. His mother made sure of that. Every visit, every phone call was a reminder. "When are you going to give my son a child?" she would ask, her voice dripping with that sweet venom only a mother-in-law could muster. And every time I would smile politely and say, "Soon, Mama, soon." But soon never came. No matter how many herbs I drank, how many doctors I saw, how many prayers I whispered in the dead of night, my womb remained empty. The whispers had started around the 3rd year of our marriage. At first, they were quiet, almost respectful, as though people believed we might still surprise them. But by the 5th year, the whispers had turned into open gossip, and I could hear them even in our family gatherings, functions, and parties. "That one, she's barren," one woman would say to another as I passed by. "Obinna should just marry another wife," another would suggest, loud enough for me to hear. I stopped going to the market after that. At home, things were no better. Obinna tried to be supportive, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He loved me, I knew that, but love wasn't enough when the entire world was breathing down our necks, waiting for a child. A son, specifically. In our culture, a son wasn't just a blessing, it was a legacy. Without one, your name died with you. And for a man like Obinna, that was a fate worse than death. "Mama is coming to visit again next week," Obinna said one evening, his voice hesitant as though he was bracing for my reaction. I froze. "Again?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know how she is." Yes, I knew how she was. Mama Obinna didn't visit out of love or concern. She came to inspect, to remind me of my failure, to make sure I knew just how much I was disappointing her and her precious son. That night, after Obinna fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of everything pressed down on me until I thought I might break under it. I needed answers, real answers. The doctors hadn't helped, the herbs hadn't helped, the prayers felt like they were bouncing off an empty sky. Something had to change. The next day I made an appointment with yet another doctor. This time I went alone. I didn't want Obinna there. I didn't want to see the hope in his eyes, only to have it dashed yet again. The hospital was cold and sterile, the kind of place that made you feel like a statistic instead of a human being. I sat in the waiting room, my hands trembling in my lap, trying to convince myself that this time would be different. This doctor, Dr. Namdi, came highly recommended. He was supposed to be the best in the city. If anyone could tell me why I couldn't conceive, it was him. When my name was called, I walked into his office, feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. Dr. Namdi was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He greeted me warmly, but I could see the seriousness in his expression as he flipped through my medical file. "Mrs. Ez," he began, his voice calm but grave, "I've reviewed all your previous test results, and I've run some additional scans." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I had heard variations of this speech before. The doctors always started with the same rehearsed tone, as if they were trying to soften the blow before it came. "There's no easy way to say this," Dr. Nanamdi continued, his eyes meeting mine. "Your womb, it's missing." At first, I didn't understand. Missing? What did he mean, missing? My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. "You mean it's damaged?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "No, Mrs. Ez, it's not damaged. It's gone. There is no sign of a womb in your body." I stared at him, my heart sinking into my stomach. No sign of a womb. How could that be? I had always had my period. I had always felt the monthly cramps, the pain. How could I not have a womb? "I've looked at your scans from previous doctors," Dr. Namdi said, "and it's clear that at some point you did have a womb, but now it's just not there." I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. My womb was gone? Just gone? How could a womb disappear? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Is there anything that can be done?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dr. Namdi sighed and shook his head. "I'm afraid not. This isn't something that can be explained by medical science. I've never seen anything like it before." I left the hospital in a daze, my mind spinning with questions. How could my womb just disappear? Was this some kind of mistake? But as I thought about it, the dream from the night before came rushing back to me. The blood, the emptiness, the old woman with the glowing eyes. Could it have been more than just a dream? Could it have been a warning? For days, I didn't tell Obinna about the diagnosis. I couldn't. How could I look him in the eyes and tell him that I was broken beyond repair, that I didn't just have fertility issues, but that my womb was gone? The very thing that made me a woman, the thing that was supposed to carry his legacy, was missing. I threw myself into my daily routines, pretending that everything was normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. The burden of the secret weighed heavily on me, and I found myself avoiding Obinna more and more. I couldn't face his questions, his hope, not when I knew the truth. But the truth had a way of creeping up on me when I least expected it. Every time I looked at Obinna, I saw the man I had married, the man who had stood by me through everything, and now I was hiding the most devastating news from him. I couldn't keep it in forever. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, Obinna asked, "How did your appointment with Dr. Namdi go?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't expected him to ask. I had hoped that he would forget, that the subject would never come up. "It was fine," I said, my voice faltering. Obinna put down his fork and looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "What did he say? Are we going to try something new?" I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, and I quickly looked down at my plate, trying to hide them. But I couldn't keep the truth from him any longer. It was tearing me apart. "Obinna," I whispered, my voice shaking, "there's something I need to tell you." He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," he said softly. I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face. "Obinna, my womb, it's gone. There's no womb." For a moment, Obinna said nothing. He just stared at me, his face unreadable. I could see the shock in his eyes, the disbelief. It was the same disbelief I had felt when Dr. Namdi had told me. "What do you mean it's gone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, struggling to find the words. "The doctor said it's not there. My womb is missing." Obinna sat back in his chair, his eyes wide with shock. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. "How is that possible?" he asked, his voice rising with frustration. "How can a womb just disappear?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "The doctor said it's something he's never seen before." For a long moment we sat in silence. The weight of the news hung in the air between us, suffocating. I could see the pain in Obina's eyes, the disappointment, and I knew that no matter what he said, no matter how supportive he tried to be, this would change everything. Finally, Obina stood up from the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't say a word as he walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. I sat there, alone, the weight of the world pressing down on me. The silence in the house after Obina left that evening felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I sat at the dining table, staring at the food that now seemed tasteless, my mind spinning. What now? What would I do? My womb was gone, and even science had no explanation for it. I tried to pray that night, but even my prayers felt hollow. The words came out of my mouth, but my heart wasn't in them. I was angry at God, angry at life, angry at myself. Why me? What had I done to deserve this? But no answer came, just the suffocating silence of the dark night. A few days passed, and Obina returned home. He didn't speak about what happened the other night, but I could tell that something had shifted between us. He was distant, his usual warmth gone, replaced with a kind of coldness I hadn't felt from him before. The strain was unbearable, but I didn't know how to fix it. What could I say that would make things better? Then one afternoon, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone rang. It was my sister, Adaora. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I sighed, unable to hide the exhaustion in my voice. "I don't know, Adaora. I don't know what to do anymore." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Adaora spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I've heard of someone, an old woman. She lives in a village not too far from here. They say she's different." "Different?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean?" "She's spiritual," Adaora replied, choosing her words carefully. "They say she has powers, that she can see things others can't. Some people say she's helped them with things that no doctor or priest could fix." I frowned, feeling a flicker of skepticism. "Adaora, you know I don't believe in those things." "I know," Adaora said gently. "But what do you have to lose? You've tried everything else. Maybe she can help." I wanted to dismiss the idea immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the desperation, the hopelessness I'd been feeling for so long, or maybe it was the lingering thought of that strange dream, the one with the old woman and the pool of blood. Was there more to it than just a dream? Could it have been a sign? After a long pause, I sighed and said, "All right, I'll go." 2 days later, I found myself on a dusty road, heading to a village I had never been to before. The journey was long, and the farther I got from the city, the more I felt like I was stepping into another world. The air was different here, thicker, heavier, almost oppressive. There was a sense of ancientness to the place, as though the land itself held secrets too old for modern minds to understand. I finally arrived at a small, humble hut on the outskirts of the village. It was surrounded by thick vegetation, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect, but I had come too far to turn back now. An elderly woman, bent with age but with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling sharpness, sat outside the hut as if she had been waiting for me. She looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like she was seeing straight through me. "Welcome," she said in a voice that was both soft and commanding. I swallowed nervously and approached her, my hands trembling. "Are you the one they call Mama?" She nodded slowly. "I am, and I know why you're here." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't even told her my name, yet she knew why I had come? "You do?" Mama smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Child, I see more than what is in front of me. You've been carrying a burden for too long. Sit down, we have much to discuss." I sat across from Mama, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The air inside the hut felt thick with a presence I couldn't quite explain. There were no pictures on the walls, no icons or religious symbols, yet there was something deeply spiritual about the space. Mama closed her eyes and began to hum softly, a low, melodic tune that sent chills down my spine. After a few moments, she opened her eyes and fixed me with a piercing gaze. "You've been searching for answers," she said quietly. "But the answers you seek are not in the physical world. Your problem is not of flesh and blood." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what she meant, but I could feel a deep sense of foreboding settling over me. "Your womb, it was taken from you," Mama continued, her voice low and serious. "Not by any doctor, not by any illness. It was taken by someone who has power over you." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Taken? How? Who?" Mama's eyes darkened, and she leaned in closer. "Your mother-in-law." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My mother-in-law, the same woman who had been pressuring me for years to give her a grandchild, the same woman who had never once shown me any kindness? It couldn't be. Mama nodded, as though reading my thoughts. "She was never in support of your marriage. From the beginning, she saw you as a threat. And when you had that small misunderstanding during your courtship, she decided to take matters into her own hands." I remembered the argument, how small and insignificant it had seemed at the time. It had been about something trivial, something I couldn't even remember now. But Mama Obinna had taken it personally. I had felt her coldness ever since, but I had never imagined that it would go this far. "She went into her dark spiritual room," Mama explained, her voice steady and calm, "and she conjured a dead baboon's womb from the black market. She pounded it in her mortar, grinding it to shreds, and through dark spiritual means she replaced your womb with the womb of the dead animal." I felt sick. The room spun around me, and I clutched the arms of the chair, trying to steady myself. How could this be real? How could something so horrible happen without me even knowing? "The physical disappearance of your womb is the result of that ritual," Mama said softly. "Your mother-in-law made sure that you would never bear children, but she didn't account for one thing." "What?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Mama smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "She didn't account for the power of the light. You see, no matter how deep someone delves into the darkness, the light can always break through, and that is why you are here." I left Mama's hut that day feeling like my entire world had been turned upside down. Everything I had believed about my life, my marriage, my struggles, it had all been a lie. My womb had been stolen from me by a woman I had called family. Mama had warned me not to confront my mother-in-law directly. "The darkness feeds on confrontation," she had said. "You must fight this battle in the spiritual realm, not the physical." She gave me a small vial of oil and told me to consult with a man of God she trusted, someone who could help me pray for deliverance. "The fight won't be easy," she warned. "Your mother-in-law will not give up easily, but with faith and the right guidance, you can break this curse." That night, I lay in bed, the vial of oil clutched tightly in my hand. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with thoughts of what Mama had told me. How could I face my mother-in-law now, knowing what she had done? How could I continue living in this house, pretending everything was normal? But as the night dragged on, my thoughts shifted. I wasn't just a victim in this. I had been wronged, yes, but I had the power to fight back. I wasn't going to let Mama Obinna win. I wasn't going to let her take my future from me. The next morning, I reached out to the man of God that Mama had recommended. Pastor Emmanuel was known for his powerful prayers and his ability to break spiritual strongholds. When I met him at his small church, I could feel the presence of something holy in the air. It was as though the very walls of the building had absorbed years of fervent prayers. Pastor Emmanuel listened carefully as I recounted everything Mama had told me. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he nodded gravely, as though he had heard similar stories before. "The spiritual world is very real, my sister," he said calmly, "and there are forces at work that seek to destroy lives, but we have a God who is greater than any power of darkness." He handed me a small booklet of scriptures and instructed me to fast and pray for 7 days. During this time, he said, we will engage in spiritual warfare. Your mother-in-law will try to resist, but with God's help, we will break the curse. The first few days were uneventful. I fasted and prayed as Pastor Emmanuel instructed, feeling a growing sense of peace with each passing day. But on the 4th night, things changed. I was asleep when I felt something cold brush against my skin. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, and I saw her, Mama Obinna, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You think you can fight me?" she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "You think your God can save you?" I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to be afraid anymore. I wasn't going to let her control me. Without thinking, I grabbed the vial of oil that Mama had given me from my bedside table and threw it at her. The small bottle slipped through the air like it was guided by something beyond me, and as it hit Mama Obinna's form, the glow in her eyes dimmed, and she let out a guttural scream. Her figure, which had seemed so real and solid, flickered for a moment before disappearing like smoke caught in a sudden gust of wind. The room was still, the air thick with an oppressive energy that hung around me like a heavy cloak. My heart raced as I clutched the vial tightly in my hand, realizing that this was no dream. This was the start of a battle that would stretch far beyond the physical realm. I sat there in the darkness, unable to move, wondering what had just happened. What did I really get myself into? My thoughts were racing, fear battling with the rising determination that had taken hold of me. For too long I had lived in fear and confusion, but now I was in the middle of something bigger than I had ever imagined. The following days felt like living in the eye of a storm. The calm was unnerving, as though the spiritual forces at play were regrouping for a final onslaught. I had gone to Pastor Emmanuel again the morning after the incident, recounting every detail of what had happened. He listened with a grave look on his face and told me that I had stirred the hornet's nest, but it was a necessary step. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "God is with you, but you must remain steadfast because the enemy doesn't give up easily." He intensified the prayer sessions and instructed me to continue fasting, warning me that the spiritual battle would become fiercer as we approached deliverance. What I didn't know was that things would start getting worse before they got better. That night, I had the first of many nightmares. I was walking down a dark, endless road, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The only sound was the soft pattering of my own footsteps against the cracked earth, and in the distance, a figure stood waiting. As I got closer, I saw her, Mama Obinna. She stood at the crossroads, her face twisted into an expression of fury and hatred. But it wasn't just her. Beside her were dark figures, faceless but menacing. They whispered and moved like shadows, circling around her as though feeding off her energy. "You should have stayed quiet," she hissed, her voice echoing in the empty space. "But now you'll suffer more than you can imagine." I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. I was trapped. Just as the dark figures began to close in around me, I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. This pattern continued for days. Each night, the nightmares became more intense, more vivid. I would wake up feeling like I had physically been in the middle of a war, my body aching, my mind exhausted. I knew it was her. I knew she was attacking me in the spiritual realm, trying to weaken me. But I held on, prayed harder, and trusted in the words Pastor Emmanuel had spoken. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Obinna, who had initially tried to remain supportive, began to withdraw further. He became irritable, and although he never said it outright, I could feel the resentment building inside him. One evening, as I sat in the living room, preparing for another prayer session, he finally snapped. "What's all this nonsense you're doing?" he shouted, his voice louder than I had ever heard it. "Oil, prayers, fasting, what has it gotten you? Nothing. It's been 5 years, and you're still here with no child. Now you're running to old women and strange pastors. What's wrong with you?" His words cut deep, but I didn't let it show. I knew this wasn't just Obinna speaking. This was the spiritual manipulation from his mother, working through him. "I'm doing what I believe will help us," I said quietly, fighting the tears that were threatening to spill. "Please, just trust me." "Trust," he spat. "I'm done trusting. You've been chasing shadows while the real problem is in your own head. There's no curse, no witchcraft. You just need to accept that you'll never have children and stop this madness." He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I collapsed on the couch, finally letting the tears flow. The words had hurt, but I knew I couldn't let it break me. The fight wasn't just for me, it was for my marriage, for the future I wanted so badly. As the 7th day of fasting approached, Pastor Emmanuel called me to the church for what he called the final prayer of deliverance. I had been preparing for this, praying fervently, strengthening my spirit, but there was still a part of me that was afraid. Afraid that this wouldn't work, that I'd never get my womb back, never have the child I had longed for. When I arrived at the church, the atmosphere felt different. There was a weight in the air. But it wasn't oppressive. It felt charged, like something powerful was about to happen. Pastor Emmanuel had gathered a small group of prayer warriors, and they surrounded me, their voices rising in fervent prayer. As they prayed, I felt something strange, a warmth growing in my chest, spreading outwards, filling my body with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. But just as quickly as the peace came, a cold wind swept through the room, and the lights flickered. I knew what was happening. Mama Obinna was making her final stand. Suddenly, I felt an intense pressure, like something was pushing down on me, trying to suffocate me. The room grew darker, and the prayer warriors' voices seemed distant, muffled, as though I was sinking into a deep pit. In the distance, I saw her again, Mama Obinna, standing with those dark figures from my nightmares. But this time there was no anger on her face. There was fear. She knew she was losing. I could feel her desperation as she tried one last time to hold on to the curse she had placed on me. "You can't win," she hissed. "You're nothing without me." But her words no longer had any power. I felt the warmth inside me growing stronger, pushing back against the cold. Pastor Emmanuel's voice cut through the darkness, clear and strong, commanding the spirits to leave, to release their hold on me. And then, with a final, piercing scream, Mama Obinna and the dark figures vanished. The pressure lifted, and the room was filled with light again. The days following the deliverance were quiet, but in a way that felt peaceful, not oppressive. The nightmares stopped, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Pastor Emmanuel assured me that the curse had been broken, that my womb had been restored, but I still had doubts. Would I really be able to conceive? 2 months later, I missed my period. I didn't want to get my hopes up, but when the doctor confirmed that I was pregnant, I cried for what felt like hours. It was a miracle. After years of pain, heartbreak, and spiritual warfare, I was finally going to have the child I had dreamed of. But as my belly grew, something else was happening. Mama Obinna was dying. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but when I heard that she was gravely ill, I knew I had to go see her. Obinna hadn't taken the news of her sickness well, but he didn't know the full truth of what had transpired. When I entered her room, the sight of her shocked me. The once strong woman was now a frail shell, her skin ashen, her eyes sunken. She looked up at me with a mixture of regret and pain. I did something terrible, she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. I took your womb. I didn't want you to marry my son. I didn't want you to have his children. Her confession came out in broken sobs, and as I listened, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She had done terrible things, but in her final moments she was seeking forgiveness. I was wrong, she whispered. Please, forgive me. As tears filled my eyes, I nodded, my heart heavy. I forgive you, I whispered, the words feeling strange on my lips, but I meant them. For my sake, for the sake of the child growing inside me, I had to let go of the anger and pain. As I left the room, I heard the soft, labored breaths of her final moments. She passed away that night, just hours before I went into labor. The birth of my son felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter. As I held him in my arms for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of joy, mixed with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The battle had been long and brutal, but I had won. I had my child, and I had my life back. Obinna was overjoyed, and though he never fully understood the spiritual warfare that had taken place, he knew that something had changed, something powerful and undeniable. As we sat in the hospital room, holding our newborn son, I couldn't help but think of Mama Obinna. Despite everything, I felt sadness for her, for the choices she had made, and for the pain she had caused herself. But more than that, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, for the strength I had found in the midst of darkness, and for the life that had finally come after years of waiting. Life after the birth of my son was different. There was a lightness in our home, a joy that hadn't been there before. Obinna and I grew closer, and though we never spoke much about what had happened with his mother, there was an unspoken understanding between us. The past was behind us now, and we were moving forward, together as a family. The nightmares were gone, the spiritual battles had been won, and I was no longer the woman who lived in fear. I was a mother now, and with that came a new kind of strength. But I would never forget the journey that had brought me to this place. The battles fought in the shadows, the prayers that had pulled me from the brink of despair, and the old woman with the divine powers who had set me on the path to deliverance. As I looked down at my son, sleeping peacefully in my arms, I knew that the darkness had been defeated, and in its place, a new life had begun. Follow this page or subscribe to this channel for more stories.